Here we are, folks. Welcome, welcome. And good to see everybody on, enjoying the conversation and suggested guests. Quite a few of those people I've already tried, and for various reasons, they don't necessarily want to engage with me. I can't understand why. Maybe it's because I don't have the perspectives that they have. But we have had Malcolm Roberts on previously, and Senator Rennick, of course, both live in various points in the past. So maybe again in the future, we'll see. Anyway, welcome. And we're just going to go with Leith in a moment or two, just to give you a quick update on things. The dogs are here, sound asleep, having had their walkies and everything else, and their lunch. So they'll hopefully be quiet over the next hour plus. And as normal, of course, the studio set up, Leith's teed up, ready to come in over there. We've got the various other things running here with the various screens, the chat and the multi-view, and everything I think is running well. We did have a couple of hiccups with some technology over the last few days, but I think it's all fixed now. You won't believe how often I have to sort of quietly fix things in the back. But anyway, hopefully we're all hanging in, and very important conversations, even, of course, a lot to talk about with regard to housing and some of the sandcastles that have been built in the air there, but also sandcastles around students and maybe some of the employment statistics, and all of those things will form part of the conversation tonight. I'm going to take the pre-show off. I'm going to start the show, and I'll be back in just a moment. Well, good evening and welcome to this live stream on the 13th of August, 2024. It's Martin North here from Digital Finance Analytics. Great to have you on this evening. Welcome to another live stream. And going to bring Leith in just a moment. We're going to have an economic-based conversation tonight, but so many important things to touch on. Just before I bring him in, let me just remind you that we don't provide specific financial or legal advice. This is a general conversation only. We moderate the chat, but encourage all the comments and conversation. Just bear that in mind when you make your thoughts. And if you've got specific questions, throw those into the chat too. If you use that walk the world, that'll make sure that it gets into my queue and to get my attention. We've also enabled Super Chat, which means that you can get to your question to the top of the list. Always greatly appreciate, and thanks to Jerry already for making a contribution tonight. And also, if you would like to help what we do around here, again, use Super Chat. We don't do this for profit. We do this because we think it's a really important conversation. And frankly, some of the conversation points that we're going to touch on tonight should be being talked about in the mainstream, but, well, quite often, for some reason, doesn't necessarily get there. But never mind. We keep our end up, and Leith is certainly there too. Leith, hello, welcome. Media star these days.
Thanks, Martin. Yeah, g'day, everybody. Thanks for having me on again. I think we've got a lot to talk about. It's going to be very spicy tonight, Martin. Very, very spicy indeed. I've got a lot to say about a lot of issues.
Well, that's good because, there are really, really some important issues to talk about. And I suppose we should probably go in both beats. Our new beloved housing minister, recently appointed, and trotting out the most remarkable platitudes with regard to solving the housing situation without taking any account of the demand side of the equation. Right? It's all about supply.
That's right, mate. Look! What a fantastic segue there, and let's just rip the Band-Aid off and get right into it. Now, if you don't mind, I've got quite a lot of charts and slides and everything to present tonight. But for those you don't know, if you don't mind switching over to the slideshow, Martin, this is our new housing minister, Claire O'Neill. I've used a bit of a sneaky photo, obviously, looking a bit sinister there. But she's actually a failed Home Affairs minister. And why is it that she's failed? She failed because she delivered the biggest surge in net overseas migration in Australia's history. Yet she's now become Australia's housing minister. This is really funny stuff. So in the Albanese government's first federal budget in October 2022, Labor predicted, well, the federal budget, I should say, predicted that we'd have net overseas migration of about 470,000 over the first 2 years. And guess what? We actually got 980,000 over the last 2 years. So it was pretty much double, well, a little bit over double what Labor projected in their first federal budget. You can see the chart at the bottom there. Absolutely unbelievable explosion in net overseas migration, off the charts, literally, like we'd never seen before. And It's also worth pointing out that since Australia's net overseas migration was ramped up in the mid-2000s, so around about 2005, Australia's actually led the developed world in population growth. So I've got a chart here from using World Bank development indicators. Now, it only goes to, it's not totally up-to-date data. It's a little bit lagged, it's probably a year behind, but based on that, Australia's population grew by 32% between 2005 and 2023, according to the World Bank, and that's higher than Canada, 24%, New Zealand, way higher than the OECD total of 12%, United States, United Kingdom, Euro area. Well, we've had this ginormous population growth, obviously, which I talk about every time I'm on this show. We got 650,000 roughly population growth last year, 2.5% annual growth rate, which is the highest since 1952. So, is there any wonder why Australia has a rental crisis currently? So, interestingly, the chart on the left and the chart on the right. So I've got the chart on the left is temporary visa holders in Australia. The chart on the right is asking rents from SQM. It's a hell of a correlation, I would have thought there, Martin. What do you think?
It looks suspicious, doesn't it? Are you saying that there's some correlation between high migration and rise in rents and all of those things? Funny that.
Yeah, I don't know how that could be. I don't know how it could be because all the supply side boosters, the Peter Tulips of this world, the tulip bubbles, like to tell us that it's a supply side only housing market, and that's what Claire O'Neill likes to tell us as well. So hilariously, our esteemed former Home Affairs Minister turned Housing Minister Claire O'Neill has repeatedly attacked the coalition government. Ever since she got into office and beforehand, before Labor even won, over the massive surge in temporary migration under the coalition, and that Australia had become permanent temporary migration and economy and how terrible it was and all this sort of stuff. And yet the number of temporary migrants under her government has increased by about 500,000 from what it was in 2019 before the pandemic, which was the peak then. So that's showing clearly the chart on the left that comes from Justin Farbo, Antipody and Macro. And as a result, rents exploded. Funny that. And so here's the question for you. Well, for everyone, I should say. Why do you think Claire O'Neill was made Australia's housing minister, given she stuffed up immigration so badly and delivered us the rental crisis effectively? Well, here's why. This was reported in the ABC, and according to an Albanese government spokesperson, Labor needed a, quote, stronger communicator at a time when anger about housing is at record highs. The government believes the housing portfolio needs its strongest, sharpest public performer since the housing debate has largely been lost by Labor. So what does that tell you, guys? And ladies and gentlemen, I should say. It tells you that they needed someone who was good at political spin. So they don't actually want to fix the problem, because if they want to do that, they'd probably look at the immigration side first, because given that, you can't, it's pretty hard to provide enough housing for an extra 650,000 people in a year. But they care more about political spin. And, O'Neill's already out there banging on about supply. She did an op-ed in Fairfax over the weekend, or she was quoted in Fairfax widely about how it's just terrible. It's intergenerational injustice that we don't have enough housing and all this sort of stuff. Didn't once mention immigration, which she stuffed up. And this is why, the whole situation is an absolute joke. And meanwhile, if you don't mind just swing you back for 1 second, just to add to the point, we've all seen, Albo's mythical housing target. So just as anyone who's fresh, new to this issue, the Albanese government last year went to National Cabinet, talked to all the premiers and that sort of stuff, came out of the National Cabinet and said, I've got the solution. I'm going to fix the housing crisis. Australia is going to build 1.2 million homes over 5 years. We're going to build 20,000 homes a month, 240,000 homes a year, or 200, for 5 consecutive years. Now, the chart on the right shows Australia's record, history of housing dwelling completions in Australia. And Australia's highest ever year of dwelling completions was 2017, when we built 223,500. And we've got Albo's target there in the red. So our highest year in history in 2017 was 7% below Albo's target for 1 year. And that was when we had interest rates of 1.5% versus 4.35% currently. That's when we had construction costs that are about 40% lower than they are now, Martin, because the pandemic hadn't come along yet. We also built in, if you actually look at the type of supply that we built, it was a lot of that crappy high-rise, dog boxes in Sydney and Melbourne, which end up being, wrapped in flammable cladding, have balcony defects, have water damage, leaks, all this sort of stuff. It's sort of stuff that basically is rubbish. We had Opal Towers, Mascot Towers with huge structural defects. People have been left with shoddy apartments, left basically burning their life savings. Got to spend tens of thousands of dollars getting these shoddy apartments fixed. But even with those shoddy apartments going up like ticky-tacky, we still only built 223,500 homes. And yet Albo, the brainiac, seems to think that magically, with 40% higher construction costs, higher interest rates, 3,000 builders roughly going bust in the last year, and builders competing for labour and capital and resources and material against big build infrastructure projects, that we're going to magically build 240,000 homes a year. Now, unfortunately, Martin, it's not going too well because, as the chart on the left shows, Australia's current dwelling construction is tracking about 1/3 below Labor's target. So last year we built about 170,000 homes, and dwelling commencements is tracking way below that. It's tracking about 160,000. Approvals about 160 as well. So we're tracking, we already missed the target by, 170, 240. Yeah, so what was it, 70,000 last year, and we're tracking the forward indicators are nearly 80,000 behind. So we don't have a snowflake's chance in hell of meeting this target.
I'll tell you something, Leith. You might be interested. The UK just announced a 5-year building program of 1.5 million homes, all right, in the UK over the next 5 years. And in fact, last year they managed to build 320,000, I think it was, which was a peak year in the UK. So it's a stretch target. But it's interesting if you compare the number that we've built in recent years in Australia and the UK relative to the population. Australia's done way better than almost anywhere. So it's not like we haven't been building, right?
No, and
we're not building enough. We can't do it.
Mate, you can't keep up with this obscene population growth.
Yes.
That's the fact of the matter. And anyone who tries to argue otherwise, the Peter Tulips of this world, you just look at the empirical evidence. Like look at what has happened in the last 20 years of this big Australia rubbish. Like the fact of the matter is we just haven't done it. We haven't built enough housing. We haven't built enough infrastructure. We haven't built enough hospitals. We haven't built enough schools. Meanwhile, we're now so my area in Ashburton, Melbourne, it's pretty low density, but pretty much every house that gets knocked down now is replaced with 2 or 3, right? It's not happening at a certain pace or anything, but every time that happens, we lose trees. So I went for a walk today with my wife because luckily Melbourne's weather's been absolutely beautiful the last few days, 21 degrees sunny today. So hence I got a bit of a August tan, which is unusual. But, walking around now, you walk past, there's a block that gets leveled, all the trees get leveled. So how much green space do we lose in doing this? And here's the thing, Martin. So the Victorian government, Melbourne's population at the turn of the century was 3.5 million people. It's now about 5.3 million. So it's added, massive amount of 1.8 million people this century. According to the state government's own forecasts, Melbourne's population is supposed to go to 9 million by 2056. So that's in 56 years, it will have gone from, if these forecasts come to fruition, that is, will have gone from 3.5 million to 9 million in 56 years. So it took Melbourne 170 years to get to 3.5 million people. And then it's supposed to go to 9 million, right, in just 56 years. Like, this is just insane growth. And under the Victorian government's own housing plan, Melbourne, or should I say Victoria, is supposed to add 2 million, Melbourne actually, 2 million people, homes in its existing urban footprint in that period of when we're meant to go to 9 million. So that means that effectively for every 2 houses in Melbourne, we're going to add another house in existing areas. Like, how can you do that without completely changing the character of the city, the footprint of the city, without tearing up gardens and trees and everything else to make way for the development. It's just not possible. And yet this is Australia's plan here. Like, it's not just Melbourne, it's Sydney. Like Sydney, the Urban Task Force projections. So Sydney, as of the 2016 census, had about, I think it was 57% detached housing, maybe it was 56%. And by 2057, which is the Urban Task Force projections, Sydney's detached housing was supposed to go from like 56 or 57% down to 25%. And then apartments were supposed to take up half of your entire dwelling stock in Sydney, with the townhouses making the rest. You know, basically 25% detached houses, 25% townhouses, 50% apartments. That is a ginormous change in a relatively short period of time. What it basically means is that, you know, forget the Australian dream, but you're going to have 25% of households in Sydney living in a detached house with a backyard, and everyone else is going to be living in high density or higher density. Is this what we want? I don't think it is. And this is Australia's plan. This is Australia's plan. Just keep growing like a science experiment. Keep ramming up the cost of housing. Convert everyone into, you know, shoebox living, group housing, bloody tiny homes, granny flats, whatever it is. And that's supposed to be a betterment of our living standards. And we're supposed to somehow, like all the immigration boosters, the Peter Tulips of this world, you know, all these other charlatans, try and say that they try and gaslight you into saying that this is good for you. You know, this is good for your welfare, and this is good for your standard of living, and it's going to be good for your children and grandchildren. I've got something to tell you, mate. It's not. Who the hell wants this?
So
I certainly don't.
It's
I don't
very interesting, Leith, that the Greens, of course, say this housing crisis has nothing to do with migration at all, which I find a really interesting dissonance between, you know, protecting the environment, et cetera, right? You know.
The fake Greens. They are the most fake party. Look, I mean, look, I hate all three of them, to be quite frank, you know, and anyone who knows me or has followed me for long enough knows that I can't stand any of the three parties. But the Greens, I find almost the most hypocritical. Labor's actually up there as well. At least the coalition, I don't like them either, but the coalition are kind of honest in that I expect them to be scumbags because they're, you know, they represent big business, right? That's their MO. And it's like, well, they tend to do that, right? So at least I expect them to do that. Whereas Labor pretends to be a working class party, and that knifes you in the back. And then the Greens pretend to be an environmental party, yet they are the most open borders outfit in Australia, right? Which is the most environmentally destructive thing you can do for Australia, is just to keep growing the population like a science experiment, chew up all your green space, you know, put stress on everything, more waste, more everything. Just go and read the 5-yearly, you know, State of the Environment report, and it'll tell you that. Yet they harp on about all this other stuff like social justice stuff and rents and, you know, the poor old renters and all that. Yet they endorse, they always want more immigration. And even the notion like of cutting immigration, they say, you can't do it, it's racist, it's xenophobic, all this sort of stuff. It's just an absolute farce. And then they hide behind this net zero banner. Oh, you know, that Australia can miraculously have net zero emissions by 2050, whatever it was, 2050. Yet we're going to grow the population by 50%. Like, how does that work? And we're going to have 50% more consumers and 50%, you know, we're going to, under the intergenerational reports projections, right, by 2063, Australia's population is supposed to grow by 50% from what it is now. So in 39 years, we're supposed to have 13.5 million people. Right, that's a Sydney plus a Melbourne plus a Brisbane worth of people now to Australia's existing population in just 39 years. That'll require at least 5.5 million homes to be built once you count for demolitions. How much carbon is going to be in those homes that you build? What about all infrastructure? What about all the schools? What about all the hospitals? What about everything else? What about all the extra waste, all the consumer goods, all the extra cars people will buy, everything? Like, this whole notion that we can magically keep growing like a science experiment and then have zero emissions is just fantasy land stuff.
Absolutely.
So, you know, I just find politics in Australia, Martin, just an absolute farce. Like, it's almost, it feels like when I write Macrobusiness, I'm writing The Onion. Only it's depressingly real, all the stuff we've got to deal with, because we just get gaslit from all sides.
Yeah.
You know,
unfortunately, it's true in the UK as well. But that's why data is important. And just coming back to your slide there, this is just a very important stake in the ground. If you look at the percentage of construction workers in Australia, right? So these are the real constraints. And of course, we've also got a lot of infrastructure building going on as well. So not only are we building more, but we've actually got more things that want to be built. And so once again, there is a complete gap between the theoretical spin story and what is practical and what is real. And it's this gap between reality and spin, which to me is the real problem.
100%. Look, everything is spin. Everything's gaslighting, right? So, a classic example. Do you mind if I segue to today's wage growth data, if that's all right?
Yeah, go for it.
Because it's just a classic example of this spin, right? So, let's get the slide. Sorry, guys, you're in for a chart pack tonight. So I'll just have to find the slide. So if you flick back, so Australia's, the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, released Australia's Q2 wage growth data. Now, wages grew by 0.8% over the quarter, yippee. But it was less than inflation, right? So headline inflation was 1% over the quarter. So for 2 consecutive quarters, Australia's real wages have fallen. And they're currently tracking 7.2% below their June 2020 peak at around 2010 levels. That's the chart in the middle there. And as I said when I wrote this up, so the ABS released it, I wrote a quick post on the data, and I said, I can't wait for Albo or Jim Chalmers to try and spin this. Right on cue, like literally, I reckon an hour after I wrote that, Martin, Jim Chalmers penned the tweet on the left. This is the sort of BS that Australia has to deal with. So it says, Jim Chalmers, annual real wage growth has grown for the 3rd consecutive quarter under Labor. It's like, okay, so he's using the annual growth rate because the annual growth rate was 4.1%, inflation was 3.8%, therefore it's growth, right? But when you actually look at the quarterly and you look at the chart on the right, does that look like much growth to you and much of a rebound? It doesn't, right? So we had a little bit of an uptick and then it's fallen for 2 straight quarters, but year on year, it's still up slightly from what it was the year before, real wages I'm talking about here. And then he said, annual nominal wages have hit 4 for 4, growing by at least 4% over the last 4 quarters, which never happened under the Liberals. Yeah, but earth to idiot. We've had super high inflation over that time. Therefore, real wages are down at bloody 2010 levels. This is the sort of crap that we get dished out from our politicians religiously. And to add further insult to injury, last week, the Australian Bureau of Statistics released the cost of living indices for the June quarter. That's the chart on the far right. And the important one for most households, because is the employee household, right? So that's the household where you have someone in your household working. The rest are, retirees or you're on benefits, whatever. That's the second set of bar charts from the top. And employee households experience a 6.2% rise in their cost of living in the year to June. So I don't know about you, Martin. Like, I don't know. I'm not a mathematician, but I would have thought that 6.2% cost of living increase is higher than 4.1% wage growth. What do you reckon?
Well,
I don't know. It's just
sorry.
I don't want to demonetize you. But
yeah.
So, Jim Chalmers there.
Yeah, I know.
4 for 4, mate. Wages rocketing under Labor. Are you serious, mate?
Yeah.
Like, this is the sort of stuff that we get dished out, and it drives me nuts.
So here's the trend story, right? This is the same index, the employer LCI, but going all the way back to the beginning of June 2000. And you can see there this massive hike up, and it's way above, the trend is clearly we're way above where incomes are. So households are still going backwards. And I don't know what your analysis shows, but certainly for many people, they are now in a much worse position than they were 15 or maybe even 18 years ago. So this isn't just an immediate inflation-driven thing. It's a much longer-term problem.
And this always happens. So I put together a massive chart pack thinking, I've got everything covered tonight. And then, as always happens, man, we talk and I'm like, why didn't I include this? Why didn't I include that? Tarek Brooker, but I know you have Tarek on a lot. So yes. Tarek did a fantastic article I think it went up on the weekend.
Yes, it did.
Right? So if you go to avidcommentator.com.au, that's Tarek's website. Go and check it out. It's his latest big one. And he did a great article on. It basically showed the changes in consumption, real consumption. So that's what I've taken account of inflation over the past. I think it was 2 decades between the different age cohorts. And what it showed is that basically anyone under 40 has had zero or negative growth in their real consumption for the last 20 years. And it's gotten particularly bad in the last couple of years. So in the last 2 years, it's gone sharply negative for young people. And that's because rents have gone through the roof. And also, especially if you exclude housing costs, and also mortgage payments have gone up, obviously. So this whole notion that, and then I could have added to this chart pack, which I just forgot as well, another one, is that real wage chart is emulated with Australia's real household disposable capita, real household disposable income per capita, which is also tanked. And that is actually that Australia recorded the biggest decline out of, any decent sized advanced nation last year in real per capita household disposable income. So look, this whole notion, Jim, and I'm sure Albo probably did a tweet later in the day, I didn't check it, but this whole notion that Australians are, workers are doing great under Labor is just an absolute farce. I'm not saying it would have been necessarily better under the coalition or much better, but I just hate the way politicians always try and spin, what is effectively a turd into gold. And it just happens all the time, mate. Like, it happens all the time. We see it all the time with energy as well. Like, Albo's always, Labor is cutting electricity costs. Labor's lowering your energy costs. It's like, yet Australia's energy costs have gone through the roof under Labor because we haven't reserved East Coast gas. So we've had soaring gas prices, which ergo means soaring electricity prices. So
we'll come on to energy in a second ago. I just want to focus in on this wages because there's another angle here. If you actually then start segmenting wages growth by different types of industry, for example, what you discover is quite a lot of it is actually in the lower paid public health sector and things like that, right? Which of course they do need the wages growth. Sorry, I'm ahead of you in terms.
Oh, sorry, no, I'm trying to. I've got that data for that, so I'm just trying to. Sorry.
Okay, I'll let you find it.
Keep talking. I was having to find a way of talking, so I can just go. Oh yes, as you said.
Yeah. So the point there is that actually it's not equally spread across all of the areas in the population, and what that means is. Here we go.
Sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll put it up now. So what you can see there is that while it's all interest 4.1, actually it's a health care and social assistance at 5, public sector, education and training 4.3.
Government related.
And then you've got electricity, gas, water. Well, they can charge like a ruining bull. But down the other end, there's a lot lower. So it is interesting when you look at the distribution. And then when you think about things like productivity, and the relationship between wages and productivity, all of those things, again, seem to me to be out of kilter as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And this segues beautifully with the NDIS story. So, just on that. So, that chart on the bottom left, that comes from Shane Oliver. This is from today's wage price index. So basically, healthcare, social assistance, big wage growth there. The private sector, and in fact, the ABS noted, in their wage price index release that basically private sector wage growth had fallen to its lowest level over the quarter for, I think it was since 2020 or something. So the private sector's, wage growth's coming off hard, and the public sector's propping up wage growth. And it's the same with jobs. So, every quarter the ABS releases its labour market account. So this is different to your monthly. This is a quarterly, more detailed version where it breaks it down by different industries better. And the chart on the top center there, that comes from CBA. And it shows that basically in the year to March, so this is up to the year to March, the market sector, which is effectively the private sector, only jobs in the market sector grew by only 6,000. And that's the table on the right, which I basically, broke it all down. Whereas the government-related sector, the non-market sector, that drove pretty much all the jobs growth. And for example, healthcare and social assistance alone added 218,000 jobs versus the entire market sector, which added 6,000. And to add further insult to industry, the number of hours worked in the market sector fell by about 27 million hours in the year to March. Whereas in the government-aligned sectors obviously had growth. So this is just the kind of artificial economy we've got at the moment, whereby the NDIS in particular is propping up Australia's wages, but also our overall employment and obviously the overall economy, which goes into that. And it does create a bit of a problem for future productivity, because as the chart in the bottom middle shows, this comes from Alex Joyner at IFM Investors. He showed that basically productivity growth in the government-aligned industries has been really poor over years, whereas it's a lot higher in the market sector. So if we're going to keep pivoting the economy towards the non-market sector, like the government-aligned sector, we're going to obviously have lower productivity growth. And the bottom right chart there, that's the projected spending on the NDIS. So currently, in the last year, Australia spent just over $40 billion in the NDIS. Now, according to the Parliamentary Budget Office, it's tipped to rise to, under their baseline scenario, to about $100 billion in a decade. Now, that's an incredible amount of growth in the National Disability Insurance Scheme. And obviously, that has implications not just for the sustainability of the federal budget, but also productivity growth across the economy. So, these are all things that are potentially a major problem for the Australian economy. And it's probably going to come at the same time as federal budget, tax revenues take a hit because of the commodity price correction that seems to be coming now, to be honest, quite frank. We've got China. China is basically gone ex-growth. So our iron ore price is going to tank. And also China's expanding iron ore supply into Africa now with its Sinadu, I think it's called. I think it's how you pronounce it. It's a massive iron ore mine that's going to open up. It's about 100 million tonnes. It's going to open up, I think, next year. And that's going to flood the market with iron ore and obviously push down the iron ore price. So the federal budget's going to get less company taxes from mining at the same time as we've got to pay for the NDIS, at the same time as the proportion of workers in the economy shrinks through population aging. So it's a pretty nasty equation there for the federal budget and also for the economy.
Yeah, and it's worth highlighting, I think, two things that come out of that. The first is that in the RBA, Governor gave her last press conference, she did start highlighting the fact that some of the inflationary pressures in the economy was due to the public sector spending. And, Chalmers didn't like that. And in fact, they produced a wonderful chart that showed that, headline inflation might dip for a little bit, but then it's going to come back again, whereas the underlying won't, because of course they look through the government, support for the short term, because that's not necessarily longer. But she also, again, mentioned the lack of productivity. And I'm all in favor of paying those who are looking after kids and teachers, a good amount of money for what they do. It's great service what they do. But the problem is, if you don't have the engine of the economy also firing and functioning to create essentially the power behind that, you can't afford to do the things you want to do. And that's the problem at the moment, that all of the focus is sort of messing around the edge, but they're not dealing with the real question of where is economic growth really going to come from. And of course, the other point there, going right back to the energy point, guess what? We are giving away billions and billions of billions directly to large overseas players in the gas industry, rather than actually, getting that for ourselves, as it were. And, Stiglitz was on a Q&A on Monday and highlighting just this thing again, that it's a nutty situation where we're giving a lot of stuff overseas directly, right? When we need it ourselves in terms of the economic engine.
Mate, we have turned energy should be a comparative advantage for Australia. So, economists always talk, at university, whatever, all talked about the law, the rule of comparative advantage. So economies should specialize in what they're good at, should basically lean into their strengths. Low cost energy should be a natural advantage of Australia, because guess what? We're one of the world's biggest coal exporters. We're one of the world's biggest natural gas exporters. We're swimming in stuff. And yet for some bizarre reason, we've engineered a energy shortage on the east coast of Australia, purely, really, because we've the only exporting place in the world that doesn't have a domestic reservation policy. So Western Australia's got one. They got cheap gas and electricity. America is now, the United States is now the world's biggest LNG exporter, so liquefied natural gas exporter. But guess how much they pay per gigajoule for their gas, Martin? I bet you can't guess.
Not a lot.
It's between $2 US to $2.50 US a gigajoule. So it fluctuates between that range. So that's about, $3.50 to maybe $4 Australian, not even, like maybe a bit less than $3.50 to $4 Australian per gigajoule. Guess what we pay on the East Coast? We pay, on a good day, we pay $12 a gigajoule Australian. And on a bad day, we pay $25 a gigajoule. So we're paying, 5 to whatever times what Americans pay for their gas. Yet they are the biggest exporter in the world. And the difference is that America's got a America First policy, whereby they basically won't approve a gas project unless it provides X amount to Americans first. And they examine what will be the impact on America's gas market, America's consumers, etc. if we allow this, this gas to be exported. And they look after Americans first. What we do on the East Coast is we look after everyone else first. And we don't even worry about Australia and the impacts here. And because we've got high gas prices, it means we've got high electricity prices. And the reason for that is that, especially this pivot to renewables, I'm not against renewables. I think they're fine. They've got their place. They're actually quite good. But they are intermittent by nature. So at the moment, we've had a really windless winter, right? So the wind turbines haven't been generating a lot of electricity. It's obviously wintertime, so the solar's not the greatest in winter. As a result, we've had a real dearth in solar power. And this is going to happen every winter pretty much. And when you don't have enough solar generation or wind generation, you need a backup. And the best backup is gas. And why is gas such a good backup? Because it can be turned on and off very quickly. So it's called a firming power or peaking. And we, in our infinite wisdom in Australia, we've decided to make the best form of peaking and firming to support renewables and to support the transition to renewables. We've decided to make it amongst the most expensive in the world, right? And why have we done that? Because we don't have a domestic reservation policy. So if Australia, if we had any brains on the East Coast, the federal government would be reserving gas. It would be cancelling some export contracts with China and Japan. And the reason why it would do it with those countries is we're actually sending more gas to China and Japan than China and Japan are actually need. And they are re-exporting that gas. So I've got a classic chart here. I was going to find it. Sorry. Here we go. So here's a chart on Japanese LNG imports and exports. And we could do one for China as well. I just found this one in Japan, so I thought I'd use it. So basically, the blue bars here show Australia's liquefied natural gas exports to Japan. This is both from East Coast and West Coast in the blue. And the red is Japanese LNG sales to third countries. Now, we are selling more gas to Japan than Japan needs, and Japan is then re-exporting gas. And whilst we're doing this, East Coast Australians are suffering from domestic gas shortages and globally high gas prices, while Japan and China resell our gas for profit. And this is all because we don't have East Coast gas reservation. This is absolutely moronic stuff here. And I'll tell you what's even worse, Martin. The Greens, I attack the Greens a lot, but they're actually talking sense last month. I'm talking, perfect sense. The Greens last month called for a domestic reservation scheme in the East Coast. And guess what? Our Resource Minister, Madeleine King, the Mad King, said? She rejected it because she said that if we intervene in the gas market, we'd increase Australia's sovereign risk and we'd trash Australia's international reputation. And here's the kicker, Martin. King said that the Greens' demands would, quote, turn the lights off in countries that depend on Australian gas for their energy security, i.e. China and Japan. Even though we send more gas to them than they need and they re-export it for profit. She's worried that we're going to turn the lights off in those countries. Meanwhile, we're turning the lights off in our own country and we're delivering expensive gas to Australia. So the Mad King is more concerned about the welfare of Chinese and Japanese residents in Australia, which is complete opposite of what an Australian politician should do. And they're particularly laughable because Madeleine King has previously on multiple occasions praised Western Australia's gas reservation policy. So, when she's been over the West doing an interview or whatever, she's going, it's fantastic policy, delivered cheap gas and electricity prices to Western Australians, blah, blah, blah. It's like, yeah, okay, Earth the idiot. If that's true for Western Australia, it must be true for the East Coast as well. So why the hell aren't we doing it here? And it gets worse, Martin. Rex Patrick, who's a former independent senator for South Australia, penned a fantastic article in michaelwest.com, which you can read. And he actually blew the lid on Labor's incompetence on domestic gas reservation and pure treason, I've got to be quite frank. So it turns out, according to Patrick, Rex Patrick, the former coalition government were looking into options for domestic gas reservation on the East Coast, and they basically commissioned a big government inquiry into it. And that's the extract on the left there. The government inquiry was delivered late in the Albanese government's term. So in 24th of November 2021, this is obviously during the pandemic. Obviously, the election happened, whatever. So Rex Patrick did an FOI request trying to get the outcomes of this paper so it can be released public. The Albanese government rejected that FOI request. So Rex Patrick, the patriot he is, spent about $1,200 of his own money to take the issue up with the Australian Administrative Appeals Tribunal, where Rex Patrick faced absolute, bevy of expensive lawyers, government lawyers, trying to block the release of this paper. And to nobody's understanding, or maybe it's because Australia's just corrupt, I don't know. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal, this is in the highlighted stuff on the right. This is extract from the AAT, which Rex Patrick posted. The AAT rejected the release of this gas reservations paper, which was, written, paid for by us, the taxpayer who, paid for the analysis of this. Rejected it because it would, quote, offend Japan, Korea, and Singapore and their reliance on energy from Australia. So basically, it said they rejected it on the grounds that it would create, quote, potential damage arising from disclosure of information relating to gas reservation in Australia because of the very real economic impact that Australia's domestic policies could have on those countries. Can you believe this stuff? These are the traders we've got leading Australia. Like, they are more concerned about saving face with foreign governments in Asia than providing their own citizens with cheap and a reliable gas. And it's our gas. So we've got foreign-owned companies that are coming in, some of them are owned by Japan and China, who've literally set up export terminals, who are pilfering our gas, sending it to China, Japan, etc. We're sending more gas than they need, and then they're re-exporting it for profit while we're getting starved at home. We're not collecting enough tax revenue on it. We collect bugger all. And then at the same time, we're being starved of gas, which is pushing up our gas price, which means if you're a Victorian like me and you got a cold winter, it literally costs me $15 a day to heat my house. And I'm the biggest tightwad you'll imagine. Like, I run it as sparingly as I can. And I only have it set to I have it set to 17 degrees. But that's how expensive it has become now. And then that raises our electricity prices. And here we have Labor, the so-called party of the workers, who blocked the release of this and has basically stymied any discussion of domestic gas reservation. Even the coalition government, for all their faults, under Turnbull, they set up the Australian Domestic Gas Security Mechanism, which is basically a reservation scheme. Like, they set up the framework for it. And Labor has refused to use it. So Russia invaded Ukraine, the gas price rocketed, and Labor refused to use it. And then now they've actively gone out of the way, used high-priced lawyers, etc., to block Rex Patrick's petition in the Ministry of Appeals Tribunal to get this gas reservations options paper released to the public. Like, this is the traitorous stuff we have. And meanwhile, the chart on the right here this comes from Dave Lloyd-Smith, my business partner. This shows the national energy market average electricity price. So pre-Albo, East Coast Australia was paying $75 a megawatt hour, and now it's nearly $200 a megawatt hour. And all that is related to gas, right? It is gas, because the gas price has rocketed. Well, I mean, I can't say all of it, but most of it is related to gas. The gas price has rocketed, and therefore the electricity price rockets. And because the national energy market, the way electricity prices work is they take the highest bid in a certain period of time. So if you have expensive gas, and gas is always in that period of time, that pushes up the entire electricity price. And that's basically what's happened to Australia. So the solution to Australia's energy cost problem is basically to set up a domestic reservation scheme. You can do it retrospectively, no problem. We don't need that much gas. We actually burn more gas, convert it to liquid, to then put on a ship to sell to China and Japan, to ship it to then all of Australian households use and all of Australian businesses use. So, here's the chart if you don't believe me. Sorry, let me find it. Here we go. So the chart in the middle here, this is East Coast and West Coast combined, but you get the message. Manufacturing uses 6.4% of gas. Residential uses 2.6% of our gas. LNG export terminals use 7.3%. So we use more gas, converting it to liquid to put on a ship to then transport it halfway across the world to give it to China and Japan than we use for either manufacturing or for residential use. And we actually use more converted to liquid than we do in even gas-powered power plants, gas-fired, electricity generation plants. So anytime a politician says to you, Australia's got to get off the gas to meet net zero, laugh in their face. Because while they're saying that, we're literally burning more gas to turn into liquid to then sell it, to give it to Asia and China, so Asia and China can burn our gas instead. That is the farcical nature of the situation we've got here in Australia. And I'll also add that, I wish I'd put this chart, another one I missed. The US has actually dropped its carbon emissions more than Australia because it simply replaces coal-fired stations with gas whilst it's built out renewables. Because we've made gas expensive, we've actually slowed down the replacement of coal. So therefore, Australia now has higher per capita emissions than the US, when a couple of years ago, US was way higher than us. So they're actually, I wouldn't say decarbonising, or I guess decarbonising faster than Australia is, because they have cheap gas. And we're not, because we have expensive gas. So it's just, it is the most mind-numbingly stupid situation we have in Australia here, man. Like, we've literally turned a natural advantage of Australia and a competitive advantage into a disadvantage through idiotic government policy. And it's been led by this Labor government, which has literally blocked the release of a gas reservations options paper that the former coalition government in their dying days had commissioned. But we're not even allowed to look at it. And any suggestion of gas reservation of the Greens, no, we can't do that because that would turn the lights off in China and Japan, while China and Japan sell more gas than they need, while we're starved of gas. It's just obscene. Oh, sorry, I can't hear, Martin. I'm trying to fix my audio, hopefully. Can you hear me?
That's probably me. Is that better?
Oh, and I can hear it now.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Sorry, that was me. I actually muted because
good.
The dogs were a little noisy. Sorry about the... I was just saying, let me just go back and say it again. So the story is that the removal of the ability to be able to actually generate and use power at reasonable price strangles manufacturing completely.
Yes,
right?
Absolutely.
So effectively, we don't have now a manufacturing base that we might have thought we had. The government is trying to invest in sort of pick your next generation industry stuff, but actually maybe that doesn't necessarily work very well.
Yeah, and sorry.
So what we have is we've got this massively high cost of energy that translates to high electricity costs as well as gas. Manufacturing's going through the floor. So where is the growth engine? It comes back to this same question. Where is Australia's growth engine? There isn't one.
No, there isn't. And that is a fantastic point you mentioned. So everyone might have heard of Albo's future made in Australia policy. So basically, Labor's come up with this brain fart. We need to get the manufacturing going in Australia. So the solution is to basically spend about $23 billion of our money over 10 years to make Australia, to subsidise the production of solar panels, of wind turbines, all this stuff that Australia is probably never going to be competitive in. And the problem with it is at the same time as they're doing that, they're not fixing the underlying problem, which is we've given our manufacturing industry some of the most expensive energy costs in the world. And, just this year, we saw Australia's last plastics manufacturer, Quenos, announced that it's going to close at the end of the year. So it's shutting down. It's happening. And the reason they cited for Australia shutting down, for Quenos shutting down, was because Australia's gas price is obscene. And effectively, we're paying 5 times what you'd pay in America, right? So they're uncompetitive. We've seen a whole host of other firms, Nestle, PepsiCo, Brickworks, etc., all warn that Australia's energy costs are ridiculously high. Brickworks, we need bricks to meet Albo's 1.2 million housing target. And yet Brickworks is paying super high gas prices, which makes bricks more expensive, which makes it harder to meet your housing target.
Probably so, import them.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, but how do you import bricks? They're super heavy, so it's expensive. So, yes. but this whole notion that Australia can somehow be a manufacturing nation again when we've got some of the world's most expensive energy, when it should be a natural advantage. Like energy used to be one of the things Australia had an advantage in. Like we had disadvantage in distance and all this other stuff, scale and whatever else you want to talk about. But now we've turned that into a disadvantage as well. And Australia's manufacturing share is the lowest in the OECD. It's about 5% or just over 5%. And it's shrinking. And how does Albo realistically expect to boost that with expensive energy when his government will not address the problem and literally goes out of its way to block any discussion of it, as we saw with the AAT and Rex Patrick? So, under this solution, the only manufacturers Australia's going to end up having are those who are relying on government subsidies. Like they only exist because we're spending billions of dollars in government subsidies. They wouldn't exist otherwise. When the solution should be to not do those subsidies and to just deliver some of the world's most competitive energy prices, which is what Australia should have. I mean, can you imagine, an Iranian or a Saudi Arabian or someone from any of those Middle Eastern countries, oil exporters, filling up the Bowser at $2 a litre? It wouldn't happen because, it costs them 30 cents a litre because they are swimming in oil. Well, we should have extremely cheap gas price because we're swimming in gas. And then that would give you cheap electricity. But we choose not to because we're ruled by idiots who care more about foreign owned cartels. They care more about people in Asia than they do their own citizens. It's absurd.
And what do you think this argument about sovereign risk? Because, of course, that is the one that's always trotted out, isn't it?
Biggest load of crap ever heard.
Yeah, I would agree, because other entities around the rest of the world are doing that stuff, and yet we don't seem to be able to, right?
Every country does stuff to benefit their own citizens and look after themselves first. It's not. This isn't new. And hilariously, we're worried about if you don't want to, give the bird to Japan, right? Because they're, good ally, etc. Okay, fine. We give the bird to China. Like we literally 70% of East Coast gas exports go to China, right? So they are our biggest market. And China, let's be honest, rogers Australia in a whole bunch of ways. We've seen what they've done with us on, lobster exports and wine exports and everything, right? They don't think twice before giving us the bird. So we could simply not send some of our gas to China, cancel a few contracts. The companies can do force majeure, which means they're not even liable to each other because they've got clauses in there which say if the government, does whatever, you can cancel. And just cancel a few contracts and we'd have enough gas for the East Coast. Simple as that. Like none of this is rocket science. And yet we're not allowed to. And this whole notion of sovereign risk, mate, the same argument was used with Western Australia in the early 2000s when they set up their domestic gas reservation policy, right? The same players were saying, oh, you can't reserve gas. That's going to create sovereign risk. It's going to make WA uncompetitive, blah, 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 blah. Guess what? Western Australia is a bigger exporter than the East Coast is even. Like East Coast is massive, but Western Australia's exports even more. And yet they still reserve 15% of their gas for domestic use, and they've got cheap gas and electricity prices. So, they used the sovereign risk argument back then, and it didn't eventuate to anything. They still develop heaps of gas projects. They're still exporting heaps of gas, whatever. They don't tax it properly. Like they should be getting more of it like Norway. But, this whole notion, they've still got least cheap domestic gas and electricity prices as a result. So the whole thing's a farce, mate.
I've always believed the sovereign risk argument was a convenient excuse not to do the things they should be doing.
Oh, 100%. And obviously Madeleine King's choosing to use that furphy, right? So she said, sovereign risk, we can't possibly reserve gas. I'll turn the lights off in Asia while you turn the lights off in Australia. And I thought you were an Australian government. I thought you were an Australian politician.
Yes.
And I thought we voted for you, not someone in China, Japan, South Korea.
Yes.
Aren't we your customer, your constituent? Aren't you Australian? So why don't you look after your countrymen first rather than people overseas?
Well, bearing in mind, we know that the costs of living are way above the average inflation rate that's trotted out for many people, and the cost of energy is a critical cost, as well as housing. And we've already explained why housing has gone off the rails because of bad government policy. We've explained why energy has gone off the rails because of bad government policy. But there's no end to it, right? Because there's another big one we should be talking about, and that's to do with the education and students. Because, of course, our second biggest export, according to the official statistics, is our education system. But we're going to break some interesting news tonight, Leith, aren't we?
Yes. I've got an exclusive for Martin for digital finance analytics. So anyone who follows me on Macrobusiness will know that for probably 8 years, I reckon it is. I've been calling BS on this. International education is Australia's. Education exports are. Education is Australia's third or fourth biggest export, which is what gets trotted around all the time. Now, I've been calling BS on this for at least 8 years. I've got to say, and it turns out, the Australian Bureau of Statistics has finally taken note. So, just to give the quick cliff notes before I get into the meat, the ABS ranks international education. It says that it's a $48 billion export currently, right? So it's, the chart on the far right, these all come from CBA, which broke them down beautifully, just did the nice summary. Education ranks behind natural gas, coal and iron ore, $48 billion a year. About 2/3 of that is goods and services spending by students in Australia, and 1/3 tuition fees. The middle chart there shows the breakdown. Most of it's universities, also vocationals, large, and English language schools, blah, blah, blah. You get the message. So, it's a huge export, Martin. It just brings in the dough. The problem is it doesn't. So there's a few problems with this education exports data, which I've been banging on about for years. First of all, the ABS wrongly claims any expenditure by somebody on a student visa while they're in Australia as an export, right? But you and me, and I should presume anyone watching this knows that most students work in Australia while they're in Australia. And especially if you're from a poor nation like India, Nepal, etc., the chances are you come here with very little, right? You might pay for your first semester in fees, which you probably borrowed off your parents, whatever, and then you go and work jobs. And that's how you pay your way through your university. We have obviously lots of ghost colleges in Australia, like a lot of dodgy English, language schools, etc. Like with Kangaroo Institute or some names like that, and they're basically just migration scams. So you can enroll in a dodgy course, you never turn up, you get a visa, you can work and live here, etc. So the way they measure it's wrong. So they don't measure money coming into the country. They just say, if you're on a student visa and you spend money here, that money that you're spending is automatically an export, even if that money is earned in Australia, which means it's not an export. And the other thing that I've kind of cottoned onto recently is there's data from the World Bank on migrant remittances. What those are is the World Bank compiles data on basically money that's sent into countries for migrants and back to their home countries for migrants. And it turns out when you plot this data, In 2023, which is the latest data we've got, migrant remittance inflows to Australia were only valued at US 1.6 billion. So that's the blue line at the top. And guess what? They're actually lower than they were a decade ago. So that doesn't make sense. So hang on. Martin, wasn't international education a $48 billion export industry? So shouldn't we have heaps of money coming in? Turns out we don't. Migrant remittance outflows were valued at 10.3 billion in 2023. That's the orange line. And once you net those two things out, we had a net outflow of US 8.6 billion. So that is effectively about 12.5 billion Australian flowing out of the country. Now, I know what you're saying. You say, oh, hang on, but that's migrants, not just students. True. But if you plot, so we've got the enrolments data on the left from the Department of Education. So we've got record enrolments at the moment, 780,000 international student enrolments. Temporary student visas on issue. As of June, we're about 610,000. If you plot the migrants remittance data on the right against student visas on issue, surprise, surprise, they track each other. So the outflows, when student numbers go up, the outflows go up. Now, obviously, the axes aren't perfectly aligned because the World Bank probably does it on a lag by 12 months or something, but the correlation is definitely there, right? So here's my question. If the number of student visa holders in Australia has roughly doubled over the past 12 years, that's the chart in the centre, and if education was a true export, shouldn't Australia have seen a massive inflow of migrant remittances, not a massive outflow? Doesn't this suggest that maybe, just maybe, Martin, migrant remittances, international students might actually be an import because they actually send more money home than they send in? That's, hey, follow the money. And here's another thing, another angle which I've come up with, which I'm going to write about in the next few days. It was actually from a reader of Macrobusiness made the comment. I thought, I'm going to look into this. It turns out article published in the SMH last year based on university accounts, like their financial statements or their, financial releases, showed that New South Wales University paid about $200 million last year, or in 2022. And that was a year when we had very little student numbers, as the middle chart showed. So it was a low year for students. New South Wales University spent about $200 million thereabouts on commissions to education agents. Now, where do you think most of those educations are located? Probably in India or Nepal. So isn't that an import? If they're paying commissions to education agents overseas, isn't that an import? So why isn't the ABS counting that? So to put a bow on this and just to, the spicy bit of this, the ABS saw some of my articles I've written in the last week where I've been going really hard on this because obviously the Albanese government, there's this whole spectre of them doing a 40% enrolment cap on international students, which is absurdly high. So I've been hammering, and they've been using the industry's been using the $48 billion export value as a reason why we can't have a cap. So I've been obviously running hard against the export number, saying it's fraudulent. Basically, it's wrong. And the ABS today emailed me about 2 hours before I was on this show, saying that basically their excuse for the dodgy number was, this is how all other countries measure it. Therefore, dog ate my homework. And the other thing so I just said, great. Okay, well, here's the remittance data. Explain it to me. Explain how it's an export when we're sending, about $12 billion Australian out of the country every year, and the outflow of those remittances net matches the student visa numbers. Like, why aren't remittances positive if it's a $48 billion export industry? So I've sent them that, and I've said your response is on the record, and I've also raised a whole bunch of other things. So we'll watch this space. We'll see what they say, and if they don't, I suspect they either won't respond or they'll respond with the most, PR, sit on the fence, non-committal answer you'll get. But whatever happens, that answer is going to be made public, and I'm going to try and get on Sky News, Radio 2GB. I'm going to send it to politicians, like anyone who will basically air this. I want to blow this fraud $48 billion export figure up, because it is farcical that this is allowed to be reported the way it is. It's farcical that the education industry and politicians can latch onto this number like it's a real thing. And it's farcical that this can be used as a crutch to have a situation whereby roughly 1 in 30 people in Australia currently is on either a student visa or a graduate visa. Like, those are obscene numbers. And, you know, just last week, we saw The Guardian, of all places, release 2 reports. I've got one here, basically saying that this is the tweet from Tarek Brooker on the left, saying that basically Australia's universities have been handing out prestigious degrees to students who cannot speak functioning English or basic English and who do not understand the coursework, and that a whole bunch of academics were interviewed who said they are not allowed to fail international students because they're too valuable to the universities. So this is what our education system is degraded into. The Guardian also released another article, which I haven't done an extract of here, which said that basically cheating amongst international students is rife. And then the ABC radio did a segment last week whereby it interviewed a Melbourne Uni economics first year student. So that's the same university I went to. I did commerce, major in economics. So it would have been the same course. He did Economics 101. He was in a tutorial whereby the tutorial was held in Mandarin, and he was the only Caucasian in that class. So this is what Australia's education industry has devolved into. Right? We have the highest concentration of international students in the world. Sydney Uni is close to half international students. Melbourne Uni is about 45%, RMIT. They're all ridiculous numbers, higher than anywhere else in the world. And just to put that into perspective, the University of Illinois, I think it is the most international university in America, and that only has a 28% share of international students. So we are the most extreme numbers of international students, and this is what it's doing into education quality. We've got degrees being handed to people who can't speak English. We've got local students being forced into group assignments with these people who can't speak English to carry them through, which obviously wrecks their education. We have rampant cheating. We also have tutorials being held in Mandarin in an Australian university. So can you imagine being a young Australian who works your butt off at school to get into university, you end up paying high hex as well. And then once you go to university, you then find that your tutorials have been held in Mandarin and you're the only bloke in there who speaks English. Like, this is the situation we've got here. Like, come on. Who thinks this is a good idea? And then you have the politicians and the industry trying to claim that it's a $48 billion export, therefore we can't touch it because it's so valuable. This is Australia 101 here, like why this country is broken at the moment. This sort of policy, this sort of gaslighting, these sorts of lies. And, you know, quite frankly, mate, I've had a gutful of it. And it's time to, going to rip the Band-Aid off this one. And I can't wait for the ABS to respond because I think I've got them dead to rights on this remittance stuff. So watch this space.
Very interesting. And a couple of observations. Edwin, who comes on a Monday and talks about what's going on, is quite plugged into some of the chatter on Chinese students. And he was calling out the same thing with regard to all this money flowing back. So actually, it's clearly there's something going on that people don't want to admit. The other interesting observation is that in the UK, there's been precisely a similar argument with regard to the university sector, who are grizzling that the fact that they're not getting as many students locally because the birth rate's dropping. And what that means is that they're now trying to plug the gap by sucking in overseas people, and they're arguing exactly the same thing. We're an export, we're a really, really big exporter. They're trying to build exactly the same argument, but on the same species basis as we've had in Australia for a long, long time. And again, it's interesting, of course, that the university sector, who are meant to be rigorous and analytic in their approach, are completely BSing all of this. They're just
and they're releasing propaganda, Martin,
yes.
Like propaganda left, right, and centre on like these absolute BS propaganda reports, which are coming from these so-called esteemed universities, saying that, no, they don't have an impact on the rental market. No. They're not doing this. All this sort of stuff. And if you don't mind switching back, I've got some fantastic charts here. Like, we're constantly told that, we need it. It's adding to the Australia's skilled base. It's skilled labour, blah, blah, blah. The graphic on the left comes from the migration review, right? This is the big review held by the Albanese government last year. And it showed that literally 51% of international students who had completed bachelor's degrees 3 years after completing that degree were working in low-skilled jobs. So we're talking about bar attendants, baristas, waiters, couriers, postal delivery services, cleaners, those sorts of jobs. 51%. Now, let me just add, 3 years, most graduate visas go for 2 years, right? So if you're looking at 3 years after graduation, that's after the low-hanging fruit have probably gone home. So this is the cream of the crop, more than likely, right? So I'm sure if the migration review had done 2 years after graduation, it'd be probably more like 75% working low-skilled jobs. So that's more than half, just over half are working in low-skilled jobs. This is really adding to Australia's skilled base. And then the chart on the right comes from the Graduate Outcomes Survey. And that shows that international graduates have worse employment rates, lower participation rates, lower median salaries than domestic graduates. So it's just really adding greatly to Australia's skills base. I'd argue that it's just adding to the ranks of the underemployed. So, the whole foundation holding up this huge Australia's massive world-beating flows of international students, which again, as I said before, is roughly 1 in 30 people in Australia are on either a graduate visa or a student visa. These are absurd numbers. So far beyond anywhere else in the world, it's not funny. And yet when the Albanese government, flags a 40% cap at enrollments, which is so ridiculously high, it'll still keep us as the highest in the world by far. The industry, squeals like a stuck pig. And then, the latest is Jason Clare, the education minister on the weekend, was saying, oh, no. Oh, no. Yeah, he started walking back the 40% cap. So we can't even get that. And the reason why a 40% cap would be good, even though it's still way too high, is at least it would get rid of the ghost colleges who are cater purely to international students who exist only to basically as a migration scam. Because if they had to have 60% local students, most of these ghost colleges or these, dodgy private colleges would cease to exist overnight because they wouldn't be able to fill them with locals because locals wouldn't want to do them. They're only there as a migration scam. Mm. So, but even that, we can't do it. We're not allowed, as soon as this 40% cap was muted last week or, a whiff of it came out, you had, the head of the internet, the head of Universities Australia and all the other rent seekers went straight to Canberra and just did a week-long full court press on the government, pulled out all this spin, and then backed up by their, by economists like Richard Holden and Peter Tulip and all these guys who then spouted the same rubbish. And suddenly, voila, by the weekend, 5 days investment of lobbying, the Labor's now walking back their 40% cap, which really any logical person would say probably should be under 20%. Do you really want 4 out of 6 students at a university to be foreign? I don't think so. How is that balanced? And that means that in some courses, it's probably going to be more like 80%, if in business studies and, some of these other ones they do. Surely that's sort of gone beyond a reasonable number. We should be aiming for quality over quantity.
Exactly. Well, it's interesting because, my late wife was actually a university professor. And she worked in various universities for a good number of years. But she kept telling me about the fact that the quality of the courses were being reduced and reduced. The pass rates were being reduced and reduced because they had to actually pass, particularly the foreigners. And her classes were getting bigger and bigger and bigger. The ability to be able to talk English was going down. And so it was like the whole idea of this degree, the value of that degree is being effectively devalued. So at the end of it, you've got this machine, and that machine essentially is just driving the economics of the university sector. It also means, of course, that the universities became over-reliant on this income stream to cover all of their costs. And so they're now grizzling, saying, well, we can't do research, we can't do this, we can't do that, unless we get these massive numbers of people coming in. But you got to question the fundamental basis, the fundamental assumptions. And again, there's no growth here. This is not actually growing the economic engine in Australia. And I come back to that fundamental point. Where is the economic foundations of the country going based on these dumb policies?
Yeah, well, basically, look, and you're certainly right. It's certainly not growing the economy when the money's not even an export. Like it's not like we're getting this, wads of money, foreign exchange getting changed into Australian dollars and coming in, which is the traditional definition of an export. We're not getting that. And Australia's, Australia's entire growth model, let's face it, is basically just import people, build houses for them, and sell coffees to them, and debt. Right? It's basically a population Ponzi economy. It's a low productivity economy. It's not, it's just about numbers now, and it's been like that for a long time. And sadly, Australia's not the only one. Like we're Canada's doing the same approach. New Zealand, UK to a much lesser degree, if you look at the percentage terms. Although you've got the same similar problems over there. It really has become the dumb growth model has taken over the Anglosphere, really. And just one other point I didn't mention about another reason why the export figure is a joke is that international students, so people on student visas, are the only class of visa who, outside of tourists, etc., who are considered an export for the duration of their visa. So, for example, you can be in a fifth year of a student visa, right? You could have been living in Australia for 5 years. You could be driving Ubers. And when you fill up your car with petrol, that filling up your car with petrol is counted as an export, even though you're earning money driving Uber, right? So, whereas if you're on a skilled visa, when you fill up your car with petrol, it's not an export. You're considered part of the domestic economy. So that's another reason how the ABS jukes the stats, because international people on student visas are unique in that they're considered to be non-residents for the duration of their visa, even if they're here for years. And that's unlike every other visa class, pretty much. So it's another reason how the ABS jukes the stats here. And that's another question I put to them. Like, how can you justify that? So we'll see what their answers are. It's going to be very interesting. But to your broader point, I think the reason why we're seeing such a pushback against cutting immigration, cutting student numbers, etc., is that our politicians and our business lobbies and all the hangers-on who rely on this stuff have no other answers. They don't know how to create a more productive economy, so they just want to keep growing the economy, growing their profits, etc., just through sheer numbers of just adding more meat, more meat to the grinder, and obviously our individual living standards have been falling for years, but they're going to keep falling under that policy. But they don't care about that. They only care about the aggregate pie because they can get an outsized slice of the pie. They can privatize the gains while the costs are basically socialized on the rest of us. And that's effectively, I think, the underlying policy approach of Australia, unfortunately.
Yeah. And, if we come down to the economic outcome of that, of course, the GDP number might be growing because of all this activity. Whether it's NDIS growth, GDP positive, right? Or whether it's more students going through the mill of the universities, that's all activity. So that lifts the top line GDP. But when you look at then GDP per capita and actually say, so how much of the value is actually being created for people on an individual basis in the country, it continues to go backwards. And by the way, that's not just in Australia, but in the UK and a few other countries too. But it has clearly gone way off the rails. And yet, of course, the economists often paid for comment. And interestingly, there was a guy at the RBA, I think number 2 at the RBA, criticised the economist class quite nicely in a recent presentation, I think.
I've got to say, I mean, this is obviously getting off the student thing. It's probably worth, but I'm actually quite impressed with the new RBA to a lot of degrees, Martin. Like this might sound weird, but I kind of like the new aggressiveness of the RBA. So obviously we saw, Michelle Bullock, smash the state and federal governments for adding to inflation, right? For pushing up demand, etc., which I think is a fair comment, to be quite frank. But the federal government's doing it through running its rampant immigration policy into a supply-constrained market that's pushing up housing inflation, etc. Obviously, they got the NDIS thing. They're pumping money there. etc. And then you got the states with their big build infrastructure projects. So I think it's fair, but it's great to see. Like, for years, I've been critical of the RBA for not being critical of the government with its policies. And finally, it seems like they've started to push back a bit. Like, I think they're a bit sick of, the RBA's got one tool to fight inflation, which is interest rates, an incredibly blunt tool. It only impacts about a third of the population with owner-occupied mortgages directly. So you smash in one third to try and get inflation down on behalf of everybody, which is completely, blunt. It's not a surgical strike. And meanwhile, the segment of the population who's totally unaffected, which is basically older people who own their own homes and tend to be wealthier, they're spending like drunken sailors, which is affecting the RBA. And then we saw Andrew Hauser, who's the deputy governor yesterday, give a speech whereby he basically attacked the, quote, false prophets who keep trying to, attack the RBA and their inflation on their interest rate settings, etc. And he effectively had a veiled swipe at all the the AFR type crew, the economists who are constantly saying being overly hawkish, etc. and that sort of stuff. And I think it was a fair comment, but really the most impressive thing is the pushback I'm seeing from them, and they really do need to be way more vocal and attack the government when it does stupid things, because it is doing a lot of stupid things. And I'd love to see the RBA that now attack them on their energy policy, because let's face it, one of the key drivers of our inflation is the fact that energy costs have risen, gas, electricity prices, etc. And that feeds inflation across the entire economy, not just, not directly. Like, obviously energy prices are measured directly in the CPI, but it's also their second round impacts. So if energy prices go up in a cafe, for example, and their bill goes up X percent every month, well, then they're going to pass it on in higher prices to try and recover their profits. And you see that across everywhere. And so, it's an inflationary shock across the economy, more than what just this electricity price and gas price that's measured in the CPI. And I'd love to see the RBA now attack, mention or at least criticise the government for giving us an expensive energy economy. So I don't think they will, but I think their attack on their excessive spending is a start, because they did sort of break convention there. And to be honest, to be quite frank, Martin, I'm all for it. Like, they should go harder, because, as I said, the RBA's got one tool, very blunt tool. The federal government has many tools to fight inflation, and it refuses to do them. It just, it's like our governments have basically just outsourced economic management to the RBA, which only has one incredibly inefficient and blunt tool to do so, when really we need the federal government to be doing their job.
And that's really the point I wanted to sort of underscore today, right? There are policy decisions that have been taken, or policy decisions deliberately not taken. I think in some cases not taken rather than actually doing things, right? And one of the things that Albo did float earlier on was this idea of investing in particular, supercomputer here and whatever there, right? But none of that really is going to generate any of the future growth that effectively is going to be required. And so I come back to this simple question. Given the trajectory that we've currently got in Australia, given the lack of capable government that we're seeing from, frankly, other side of politics, given the fact that we've got these economic settings that we've been talking about today, and those various sandcastles that have been built around housing and around education and energy, I can't see how this comes together to create a solid, economically positive future for Australia and Australians.
Sadly, I agree with you. I think we're on a highway to hell, to be quite frank. If I had to look forward 30 years, I think it'll be exactly like, as you probably imagine, it'd be, I don't want to say Blade Runner future. That's a bit much, but you're going to have basically everyone living in cramped apartments and living a lot more poorly than they should be. And very low productivity economy. Australia, I think, will slide down the rankings of developed nations, especially if we do pivot, if the world does pivot out of, fossil fuels, etc. And there's just no will to really change things around. I mean, it's probably a little bit too late, but it's not fully too late to try and emulate a Norway, for example. Norway's sitting pretty because it does charge the correct amount of tax on its oil exports. They have tiny mineral wealth compared to us, but they tax it correctly. And as a result, Norwegians are sitting on a sovereign wealth fund, which has been born purely out of their oil and gas profits, or which has been taxed, which is worth about $280,000 per citizen. So they're rich. We don't have anything like that over here. We should be the richest nation on earth. We've had the biggest terms of trade booms. That's your export prices divided by your import prices, because the commodity price rises in the world since the early 2000s. And yet really have not much to show for it, because we've just been managed appallingly. And it's never too late to start. But unfortunately, there's no will. And the federal government just seems to be intent to just tax the hell out of workers through personal income taxes, whilst indirect forms of taxation, whether it's GST or fuel excise, shrinks as a share of total tax take. The GST shrinks because the fastest growing areas like healthcare aren't included in the GST. So as a result, it shrinks as an overall take. But the federal government seems to be intent just to keep growing the population blindly through immigration, to try and boost the number of taxpayers, to then tax everyone more through bracket creep, so that the share of overall tax coming from personal income tax just keeps rising, just bleeding the hell out of workers, while the number of workers shrinks, while it doesn't tax all these other areas. And the number one area it should be taxing is obviously resources. Like, we are one of the world's biggest resource-rich countries, but we basically just give it away to foreign companies to then gut us. And then, to make matters worse, we then double the pain by then allowing these foreign companies to then charge us some of the highest gas and electricity prices in the world on the East Coast, because we don't reserve it for our own use first. Well, we don't tax it properly, and then we don't reserve it. So we're just a country that just shoots itself in the foot, and we're basically, wealthy in spite of good management, not because of it. So, and we're the so-called lucky country. We've just been through dumb luck. We've gotten to where we are. But at some point, our luck's got to run out. If we keep making the same mistakes over and over again, at some point, we're going to have a massive haircut in our living standards. I'd argue that we've had a slow boiling frog reduction in our living standards over the past several decades. Anyone living in Sydney and Melbourne can probably appreciate that. If you're a 20-year-old in Sydney or Melbourne now, you've got a much lower chance of having a good quality of life than a 20-year-old did 20 years ago, which is basically me. I was 26 20 years ago, but you know what I mean? So, it's just, it's a fairly bleak future if we don't change things. And unfortunately, there just doesn't seem to be any will to change things, which is incredibly infuriating. And, you and I, we do our best, try and educate people and stuff. But unfortunately, it just seems like we're kind of, we're pushing a boulder uphill, a very steep hill.
Yeah, well, we've been pushing that for a few years, and I have to say that I think a few more people are getting to understand that things are not the way they should be. But it is tough, particularly when you have the mainstream paid-for economists, just spouting rubbish as well, and just spouting the standard story. I think the point to underscore is there are things that could be done very differently to be able to actually change the trajectory if there was political will and if there was enough pressure to board. The trouble is that the politicians are also being exposed to significant pressure from the large corporates, who of course like the system we've currently got, because corporates are doing very well. CEO salaries are burgeoning and everything's great. But for ordinary people, it's absolutely not. And certainly compared with 20, 30 years ago when I came to Australia for the first time, I think it's gone down the toilet, frankly. And at the moment, I don't see a hell of a lot of good news as to pulling it back in the right direction. But, create a wealth fund and start getting the right amount of income from those resources, assets that we've got. clamp down on migration to be able to actually stop that future demand, which of course is one of the things that's driving property. But also, I think we should be looking quite seriously about the type of stuff that we build, because a lot of the high-rise rubbish that we're building is going to fall down very quickly, slums and all the rest. So, there are some really big questions here, and yet, unfortunately, the government really doesn't want to come to the party and deal with those critical issues. They prefer to worry about a QR code to get your digital security idea next year, or more pay for those providing childcare. Now, those are quite laudable things, but they're not fundamentally critically important things to lay the foundations for the future. So, where is the vision?
Yeah, and also, look, to be quite frank, it's also falls on Australians. I mean, I've just been watching the past year or so, or, for longer really, but the Australians seem to get up in arms about stuff that's happening overseas rather than things that happen in their own country. Whether it's the war in the Middle East or like the Israel-Palestine conflict or whatever. And, I'm not saying those things aren't important, but I'd love to see the same passion about what's happening to them, or whether it be this, this whole gender stuff or LGBT or, whatever. Pick your cause. They're all very, massive on that stuff, pronouns and all this sort of stuff. Meanwhile, the real issues, which I'd argue is housing and energy and, all this sort of stuff, and migration's obviously linked into that with housing especially, they just silent on. And the strange thing is, it's the younger Australians who are getting, ripped off the most, who are most against any cut to immigration. They're the ones who will most quickly call you a racist or xenophobic. It's like, hang on, this isn't impacting me, mate. I live in a lowish density suburb in a biggish house because I'm old. I'm 46, so I got it years ago. So I got it, relatively cheap, and I'm old. It's you guys who are getting rogered, and it's going to be my children who are going to get rogered. But it's like, stand up for yourselves. Like, don't stop going free Palestine, all this sort of stuff. When your own things are burning in your own backyard. So how about we get some passion about that sort of thing? Unfortunately, that. So look, it's it's politicians, but it's also, unfortunately, Australians who seem to care more about what's happening in the US elections or in far off lands than what's happening in their own country. And that to me is pretty disheartening.
Yeah. And of course the sun's shining most of the time and it's a nice country to be in, but you got to, the thing that I'm trying to do, and I know you're trying to do on Macrobusiness, is trying to lift the scale so people actually see what's really going on, because actually there is going to be a tipping point at which point, some of these questions I think will come up to the surface, but it's going to be a long, slow grind. But we'll keep at it,
mate. I will do this to the day I die. So I'm here for the long. I'm dying on this hill. So you have to put up with me for a bit longer, guys.
No, that's good. Well, I should be very interested to see the response from the ABS. You must come on and tell us about that next time you get here.
I will. I will. I think they've poked the bear.
Yeah, absolutely. And if people want to find out more about you and what you do, where are the best places to go?
Okay, so number one is obviously macrobusiness.com.au. That's the mothership. That's where I write, every day, pretty much. Write heaps of stuff. That's my base. Been doing that for 12 years or so. Maybe it's coming up to 13. And the other place is I've got a YouTube channel now at Leith Vo, Leithvo. Whereby I just upload all my many media interviews I do. I seem to do one a day pretty much now. And also I've actually started doing some other explainer videos. I do try and do one or so of those a week. And those seem to be going well, where I'll break down an issue. So whether it's international education, rorts, or the gas market, or the housing market, etc., I'll do some explainer videos there. Since the last time I was on the show, which is about 7 weeks ago, I reckon. I've actually doubled my subscriber base. So I'm now at 7,300 roughly. So it's actually going pretty well, the YouTube, Martin. It's doing all right. So, give me a follow if you want to watch the sort of stuff. I seem to have the same subscribers who watch your channel. So half of you probably already know about it. or Punters Politics. It says that people who watch your channel watch yours and Punters Politics. So I'm probably preaching the choir anyway. But if you don't know about it, check it out.
Well, thank you, Leith. I really appreciate that, and all of the work in the slides, etc. We'll get you back on in the next few weeks. There'll be always more to talk about, as always. But thank you very much for this evening. And we have different Leiths. Sometimes, we have the quiet, relaxed Leith. Sometimes we have the I'm going to go for the juggler. And I think tonight you got a few jugglers. So congratulations.
Oh, thanks for that. Yeah, the ABS got me fired up. They literally emailed me about an hour or so before the show, and I was just like, all right, let's on. So. Anyway, thanks very much. I was in more of a fired up mood. I think last time I had COVID or something, so I was a bit more sedate. So I'm feeling pumped today. It's sunny in Melbourne. I've had a bit of sun. I went for a run, so I'm feeling good.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Leith. I'll take you off line now, and I'll close the show. But look forward to chatting with you again soon. Take care. Cheers. Thanks. There you go, folks. Hope you enjoyed that. And as always, truth from Leith. And, it's very important that we spread the word. So please like, share, go and check out his channel. I think a copy of this show will also go across to his channel once we've done that. Just to say that next week, we've got a new guest on. He's the guy behind Spacious. That's the online service that's providing a lot of detailed information about asking prices across the country. So we're going to get him on to talk a little bit about what he's doing and look at some of the data and perhaps paint a different picture from the way that the major property portals are preaching the story about property at the moment. So that'll be fun. And in fact, the week after that, we've got Adam Stokes coming back on to talk about crypto. So that's going to be the next couple of weeks. Anyway, thank you very much indeed for spending some time this evening. Thank you very much for all the super chats. Really appreciated them all. And as always, please like and subscribe to the channel here too. Just to show you the dog, well, a dog. Meteor's popped around the corner. Luna's now back asleep again. So that's the best I can do on the dogs. But thank you very much for spending some time with us this evening. Check out the live show next Tuesday with Spacious, and check out the recorded shows each day. We'll put them up, of course, normal sort of time, late evening as normal. This is Martin North from Digital Finance Analytics signing off. See you next time. Take care.